Welcome to Brand Navat. We are delighted to have Georgi Gardiner back on the show, and we're going to be talking about philosophy and tarot. Georgie, would you like to start with the thought experiment?
Yeah, well, this isn't so much a thought experiment as simply something that happened in my life. So this is November 2022, and I was trying to figure out whether to leave my marriage. It was like a 12-year marriage, really serious marriage. Um, we structured our lives around it. And so whether to leave was a huge deal, like a massive deal. And I went on a sailing ship, a schooner, with Rising Appalachia, a band, as part of this kind of introspective journey. And at this point, I was like throwing everything against the wall. I was trying everything, like a vision fast, 3 days alone in a mountain without any food and tent and everything. I was trying everything. And the boyfriend of the lead singer of Rising Appalachia um, was doing tarot readings. So I thought, all right, I'm trying everything to figure this big life decision out. And I tried tarot reading. And at the time, I had a lot of the misconceptions about tarot. I kind of thought it was like a vision fast. You don't do them very often, just maybe a few times in your life, or once a year, and it gives you these kind of really important, significant, profound insights. And I didn't really, so to speak, like believe in tarot. I didn't really have any experience with it. A lot of the common misconceptions. So I did this tarot reading with this guy. This guy was very taciturn, super quiet. Hadn't really spoken to him before. He really kept himself to himself. And we had this conversation facilitated by the tarot deck and the spread, the kind of way that the cards were laid out and which cards. And he asked questions and we discussed this. And my mind was kind of blown. My mind was blown. I mean, so in that, I don't know, 40 minutes, 1 hour, we had such a deep, intense, open, curious, creative conversation. The kinds of questions he was broaching, I was really struck that some of them were the kind that, had he have asked in a different ordinary conversational context, frankly, he probably wouldn't have done. And I probably would have like rejected the question as like improper, that one shouldn't consider those kinds of questions or something. But because this maybe just to give an example, he said something like, is kind of this particular life experience why you're attracted to women? Where the life experience, I won't say what it was, but it was, something like your dad's leaving your family, or you're not getting on with dad or something. Well, that wasn't the example. But that's the kind of question where, like, left liberal person, feminist, would be like, of course not. I don't even ask such a silly question, like not entertaining it. But, we actually, in the context of this social space, this container that tarot cards had generated, we talked about it. And I was really struck also that the tarot cards, it was like having another conversational participant in the space. I mean, and not, I just I liken it to that. It was throwing in interesting new perspectives and interesting new ideas and interesting new concepts. And almost immediately afterwards, I thought, I'm going to write an essay about this at some point. This is epistemically fascinating. And then, perhaps about a year later, I got an invitation to write for a special issue coming out about evidentialism. This idea that we should align our beliefs with the evidence. Evidentialism at 40, new arguments, new angles. And I thought, perfect, this is definitely a new angle on evidentialism. I defend this idea we should align our beliefs with the evidence. And I think that tarot can be a really interesting and good epistemic practice. I'm going to write up these ideas. And since then, it's kind of, the project has bloomed. So now there's been other invitations to write up aspects of this, turning it into more of a teaching and research tool. And so this kind of, just from this one reading that I did, this one discussion that I did, it's now become this philosophy project. So the tarot actually is going better than the marriage. The marriage did end, but the tarot project has taken off. And maybe I'll say that the tarot project, as I understand it, has these two aspects. One is thinking through the epistemology of tarot, the ways in which it's good, the ways in which it's not good, the different epistemic features, the epistemic questions it raises. And then there's this other project, that's like tarot as people use it, or as some people use it. Then there's this other project, which is really nascent, really experimental, very community team-based, which is using tarot as a tool in the philosophy classroom or the humanities classrooms or the liberal arts to teach as a teaching tool. And also in research contexts as a research tool. So going to at philosophy conferences, getting people to use the tarot cards to investigate their own research.
So it reminds me a little bit of writing prompts for writers. So sometimes you just can't get anything down on a piece of paper as a writer. So a fiction writer, they sit and they stare at a blank page and they need to get something down. And back in the day, I used to be a writer, and I still write a little bit. I need writing prompts to get going. And something that our group leader used to do was just throw a writing prompt at us, which would get you going, and then off you went. And something you said was interesting, which is that you don't think those questions would have arisen in the course of a normal conversation. And that strikes me as analogous with, I wouldn't have written those things had I not had the writing prompt. But the question is tarot just a random writing prompt? And what is interesting about writing prompts is they're random in one sense, that they don't track any particular intention, but they're not random in another sense, in that they're quite rich. In other words, they contain either contradictory content, or they contain vague content that could be interpreted in lots of ways. Is that what's happening with the tarot deck? Does it contain vague, rich content that could be interpreted in many different ways? But really what it is it's random in the sense that you just need anything that is vague and rich to spark the mind to think in the right kind of way to achieve the result you want, which is to make the decision whether or not to leave the marriage.
I think that's a really cool question. And so actually I was describing this project to my brother, and he's at some point he was like, oh, so it's like a random thought generator. So and I think in some sense, yes, but at the same time, like, it's not random. So the cards themselves feature things like journeys, food, a lot of kind of requests, asking for things, supplication. There's power, there's a lot of kings, family ties, or things that could be understood to be family ties. A lot of like intergenerational things, gender things. And so really important life themes, death, religion, needs, wants, hopes, travel, journeys, transitions. And these aren't random. These are really important life themes. And then, but I do think that the evocative ambiguity is a particularly important and interesting feature. So because they're so ambiguous, then different people read them in different ways, and different aspects are salient. So here, I think this is kind of an example of this. This is the emperor, who represents power, very powerful figure. But then it's like, what is he? Stern? Is he callous? Is he hard-hearted? Is he nervous about being unseated, or is he like completely like impenetrable? Like there's no way that you could unseat him. And so I think different people will see different things. And so somebody who maybe has a position of power, like an influence, and is worried about being unseated by external threats, will see him as looking nervous. And somebody else who's maybe relatively less powerful might sort of see him as like a horrible person, because he's like representing the power, like the man who doesn't care about the ordinary person. And then similarly with salient. So there's a really nice example. I did a philosophical tarot session with a research group at a conference recently, and this one came up. I wasn't in the conversation, but it was kind of funny that the two people, one was very much like, oh, this card is about the person on the journey, and then another person was like, oh, this is obviously about the laborer, the person doing the work, sort of seeing themselves as completely different. And then they had a bit of a joking kind of dispute afterwards about how, well, you call yourself a socialist and you were focusing on the passenger, not the laborer. The laborer was invisible to you. But I do think that this kind of salience is really interesting. So both how we render ambiguous faces, ambiguous countenances, how we render them is really interesting. And then also what's even salient to us. So in some sense, random, but not just like random word generator. And I think that the writing prompts is a really nice analogy there.
So most people's conception of tarot is that it's a divinatory tool, that if you want to find out what your future is going to look like, then you go to the tarot reader, who will use the cards to sort of tell you, well, this is the journey that you're on. And as you say, a lot of people see this as a thing that you do rarely in life. So it's a special occasion with the seer who has special powers. And so you're going to take the conversation really seriously. And that could go spectacularly badly. So if it is the case that the seer is a fraud and can't see into the future, you could rely on the conversation you have in a very profound way that makes you make bad decisions about your life. But I wonder if there's some value in fully buying the esoteric bit. So I was, I'll give you an example. I was watching in 2010, South Africa hosted the Soccer World Cup. And I was sitting next to a guy who was like completely decked out in regalia. He had like a Ghanaian flag painted on him and a hat and like, just looked over the top, So I said, "Oh, you've been like a lifelong fan of Ghana." So he said, "No, and I'm not from Ghana either. But I feel like the best way to enjoy, this soccer team playing is to fully immerse myself in it. And for this moment, I'm going to root for these guys as hard as I can. And once it's over, I'm not going to care about Ghana ever again." And so maybe what you need to do to fully enjoy the tarot experience is to put yourself into a mental state where you go, "I'm going to temporarily succumb to the idea that this is a seer who can see into the future. And this is going to be a momentous mystical experience," as opposed to, secularizing it and saying, "Well, this is a useful way of reflecting on my life. And, the cards have no particular mystical source." Would it be better to do the imaginary exercise?
You guys always ask such fascinating questions. I love it. So one of the points you put it is like you'd enjoy the reading more, and there's a lot about tarot that I just don't really talk about. So I don't really talk about it as like a way to make money or as an enjoyment thing. I'm just like a nerd, and I'm like an epistemology nerd, right? So I'm like, well, is it fruitful? Is it like helping you understand? Is it like kind of getting rid of mental blocks or kind of misconceptions? Is it a good epistemic tool? So there's two ways in which tarot is a good epistemic tool, I think. So one is as evidence, which is, I sort of alluded to earlier, like as evidence for what you're thinking, as evidence for your preconceptions about, say, the emperor, do you see him as mean, is like evidence about your preconceptions of power. What's salient to you is kind of revealing of what you're currently thinking about. So there's tarot use as evidence for what you're currently thinking, feeling, valuing. Then there's tarot as useful or as epistemically valuable because it gets you thinking. So it gets you kind of investing this creative attention, this having these conversations or having these thoughts and reflecting on ideas. And that the idea is, well, if it's galvanizing thought, if it's cultivating thought, and thought is typically valuable, then that's the way that it's valuable. It helps you kind of create new understanding by thinking. And that would require some investment. And so partly for that reason, one of the things that I suggest in my aesthetics paper on this, so I have a couple of different papers on it. One of them is in an aesthetics journal, so it's more focusing on the aesthetics element, is for people who are maybe skeptical or more naturalistically inclined, I suggest that maybe focusing on the images might be more helpful than focusing on the words, because the words might feel arbitrary. The tarot decks have a set of images, like cards with these evocative images, and then also words written. So each card has associated words, and it'll be like a paragraph, and there are orthodox correspondences with different words. And if you're very skeptical or naturalistic, you might think, well, this is just kind of this is just random. So why would I think more about this? Whereas you might think, well, look, how you respond to words is still really important and valuable, but it just might be harder to get invested in the words, potentially, if you're very skeptical. But looking at an image and letting those images kind of influence your thoughts and thinking about your reactions to an evocative, ambiguous image, it's hard to be skeptical about that. Now, some people might just have fewer skills at interpreting images, or images might do less for them in the same way that some people are sort of less moved by music or sort of find poetry less inspiring or less interesting. But there's not really a question that some people go to, see art and it causes them to have certain kinds of thoughts. And in fact, in one of the essays, I call tarot I call it the tabletop art gallery of the human condition. And I say that using tarot can be like going to an art gallery with your therapist on speed. So it's like, it's causing you to have these kinds of thoughts in this really intense way. So I think that's part of it, is like having the buy-in through focusing on the images. And you're suggesting a different way of getting that buy-in, which is believing in it as this kind of the metaphysical, the conception that's more magical, more what people might say derisively is woo, more metaphysically loaded, kind of this idea that there's supernatural powers to the cards, and that could be another way to get the buy-in.
It makes me think of a board game called Dixit. So Dixit is, for anyone who's not aware of it, is basically a deck of cards that each have a very beautifully drawn or painted image. They're not meant to be imbued with any metaphysical or magical or woo-woo powers. They're meant to evoke sort of a dream-like association, a set of associations. And the idea is that each of the players forms certain associations with them, and you've got to guess which of the associations apply to which of the images. And you learn about the other players through this process. So there you also have learning about people's minds. But I think what's interesting about it is it works without the woo-woo. In other words, it works without the magical portent, without this idea that it's imbued with any kind of power. And the second analogy I think about is Rorschach tests. Again, Rorschach images, ink blots are not meant to be imbued with any kind of spiritual power. They're purely indistinct, vague ink blots, which are made in such a way that they could be interpreted as anything from a person's face to a cloud to a dog to a scene of some sort. And the idea is that the patient, through discussing what they see in the image, reveals certain things to the therapist about their mind. The question I have for you is that all tarot is? So is tarot just that process of looking at a vague image, or do you think there is something additional to tarot that's special?
Yeah, so I love the comparison to Dixit. I'm very interested in this philosophy through art, play, and adventure, philosophy through these different kinds of games. And so I bought a Dixit set. I've not used it. It's just that my research account and my teaching office here would just support my kind of experimental teaching and research. So I have a Dixit set as a kind of comparison class. And I'm really struck that tarot is extremely popular. Like, so many people use tarot. Like, a lot of our students use tarot, a lot of the general public use tarot, especially more marginalized people. And then academia, it's like tumbleweed. No one is talking about tarot. I think a lot of people have these misconceptions that I did. It's really, there aren't grants on it. This is part of why I've set up this tarot project where I'm applying for grants. And I absolutely struck out. For an entire year, I submitted about 6 grants over the course of a year grant season and didn't get any. And I was kind of thinking to myself, it might be because tarot is so stigmatized and so misunderstood, and I should just rewrite the whole thing as about Dixit and then have just like it's just teaching, using images as a tool for teaching and using Dixit and other kinds of art images. And then maybe and tarot, we'll use tarot cards too. And just so I can get the funding to get the team together to start working on the projects. And I actually think that Dixit cards could be a really interesting other kind of tool in the toolkit. So tarot has a lot more structure, a lot more associations, a lot richer. So I mentioned there's a lot of cultural baggage, I guess, so the illusions, which is good. I mean, baggage in a good way. If you're going on a trip, your baggage is helpful. You have lots of stuff that you can now rummage through and use, right? So it has intentional, I think, associations with myths and legends, like ancient Greek legends. There's explicit connections to certain social hierarchies, to different kinds of foods, to different biblical themes. A lot of like theoretical, like the more that you know about literature and music and so on, the more you'll see in there, which may be true of Dixit, but maybe like less so. Tarot also has a lot more structure, I think. So it started off as playing cards, just like we have our French suited playing cards, so things that we just call playing cards. It started off like that, just for secular games that we started in Italy in the 15th century and then spread across Europe. Only much later was it imbued with these metaphysical properties by 18th century French occultists. So there's this structure, much like we know our normal everyday playing cards they have the structure of the suits, hearts and diamonds and so on. And then they have 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up, and then Jack, Queen, King, and Ace, and there's that structure. So tarot cards have something similar. And they all have associations too, which creates this kind of richness where there's these conventional associations of the cups, which is one of the suits, with relationships and emotions, the swords with rationality and decision making, pentacles or coins with material things, including health, the material world, as well as property, money, and so on. So, and then there's kind of the queen and the king have these associations. It's just like a lot of rich structure to go on. So I think that Dixit maybe has less to work with in that respect. You said like, oh, but Dixit works without the woo-woo. I also want to say, well, look, tarot also kind of works, or at least has these epistemic features, or has a bunch of epistemic features that are worth thinking about and theorizing, and I think using, whatever you think about the metaphysics. So my own project is silent on the metaphysics. It's just like, it doesn't say one way or the other. But still, I just talk about the ways it can be used as a tool. So I think it's not the contrast. The contrast isn't that Dixit works without the woo-woo and tarot doesn't. I think they both can work without the kind of metaphysical background assumptions that some people have. It's just that some people also associate tarot with these other properties, these more sort of metaphysically loaded supernatural properties. A contrast that I want to make with Rorschach, which is another really cool comparison case that you bring up, is my understanding of Rorschach tests, at least in the popular, how they're understood in the popular culture, is it's what's your first impression, your first look. Did you see a vagina, a vulva? Did you see somebody sleeping or whatever it is? And then you move on. And the first impression is kind of tells you everything. But tarot is, it's like the first impression is the beginning of the story. It's not the full story. And so then it's what's your sustained contemplation after that? Where does your mind go after that? Where do your thoughts continue? And maybe that's also true for some people's practice of Rorschach tests, but it seems less integral to the practice, whereas I think for a lot of people, tarot is much more like that. It's about the sustained conversation or contemplation. Another contrast class that I think is very interesting is so tarot started off as kind of the tarot cards that I've been showing you, the kind of standard deck. But a lot of other decks have sprung up. I mean, I've got the Philosopher's Tarot and Jungian Tarot and some more like Pride, LGBT themed tarot, and all kinds of contemporary tarot. And with this Jungian one, the images, I'll just show you, I don't use this deck, but are very it's surreal, but there's not as much going on to think about. I like to do image interpretation, and I just get kind of stuck. I just kind of get stumped. And I mentioned this to a friend, and some of them can get even more minimal. So it's just, I don't own any of these decks, but it's just it'll just be a line. It'll just be almost Asian imagery of just a couple of lines, a couple of splodges or dots or something. And I mentioned this to a friend, and I was like, yeah, it just seems less rich, less to go on. And she said, well, I think those ones are more for people who just use it as a kind of, almost like a meditation tool. They sort of meditate and then they more go inwards. And so that seems like a different approach too. And it's not one that I really do. I really focus on the visual imagery and the visual interpretation and the orthodox associations.
You mentioned two different ways of engaging with tarot. The one is on your own in a contemplative way, and maybe with a written source. So you engage in this decoding exercise to sort of see what the visuals are meant to refer to, and you could contemplate on whatever thing you're thinking about at the time. And the other one is as a dialogue with someone else. And, Jason brought up the idea of a therapist using a Rorschach test. And it seems like the conceit of a reading that's different from our ordinary discussions. We've brought in this tool that's unusual, that has these strange looking images in it, that allows us to open up a discussion that could be very intimate. As you mentioned, the opening discussion you have is about your marriage, about childhood things, the things that would be kind of impolite to mention early on, but that this moment sort of allows and provides an avenue for asking hard questions or going into dark places, because in this maybe theatrical space, those things are allowed, and it might let you shortcut certain things. So because we're in a space of play or of mysticism or of theater, we can ask questions that are uncomfortable, that would be otherwise impermissible or rude, and might then very well get us to answers that we would be otherwise afraid to have reached. So do you think that tarot then provides us with a unique source for finding out what's true, even if it comes through, let's say, a tainted pathway? So, if you think about, the scientist who's trying to find out what's true in a lab, they can say, well, I know that all this equipment works. There's a whole history behind this. And this is a good way for us to find out what's true. Here we have this thing that's quasi-spiritual, steeped in imagery of the arts. As I say, kind of could have a theatrical thing. You could imagine the seer sort of really dressing up how they sort of engage with you and the kind of words that they use and, the kind of stuff that they wear. But that those oblique ways of getting to the answer might be more beneficial.
So the one connection here is in the philosophy of science or the epistemology of science kind of debates about knowledge through falsehood, where it seems that you can get knowledge from some things where you have a bunch of presuppositions in your method, or at least approximations or misconceptions in your method. And then there's also the kind of art as epistemic tool debates and the ways in which art can kind of help illuminate certain kinds of insights, like getting insight through fiction, even though it's kind of fiction, right? And I actually, the way that you begun that question has to do with the dialogical tarot, so tarot as conversation, which is an important part of my project. So you have like solo practice, and then you have through conversation. And I think that actually that is another kind of response also to the question that Jason was asking about, well, how is this different from Dixit? Which is, if a lot of tarot is done through dialogue, through conversation, then the fact that it has all this rich, shared, interesting kind of, I've said baggage, but I mean it in a good way, illusions, cultural illusions, then actually that could be helpful for conversation, because people, whether or not they know, whether or not that's shared background knowledge, that's at least background knowledge that probably helps the conversation, partly because of the people who are more invested in it, but partly because they just have kind of more they can riff. Like you can have these really interesting, like riffing conversations. And if you listen to the tarot podcasts, you can see this in action. So there are these tarot experts who maybe also, for example, they're psychology experts. And so they'll discuss psychology themes using tarot cards. They'll draw tarot cards and then talk about psychology. And because they have so much shared, so many shared associations and cultural illusions, that you can kind of hear them kind of get excited and be like, oh, that reminds me of, and then this person's coining of. And I think that's a kind of an interesting way that I suspect that tarot differs from Dixit, although maybe has more in common with some art gallery type trips with friends. Although, again, it's sort of depending on who has which shared knowledge, because some people might go to an art gallery and not really have any associations.
I think you've done a really good job talking about the positive values, epistemic values associated with tarot. It helps us gain an understanding of ourselves. And it does this in lots of different ways, and it gets us thinking. And I can see the value in all of that. Someone could argue, though, that there's counter values happening here, and that it has negative value because of those. Not sure how one assesses the relative value of the positive and negative values, but I think it's worth mentioning at least some of the negative values associated with it. So one of them could be that it could be argued that tarot is basically deception. So what you've got is you've got someone who's predicting your future. He's purporting to predict your future, the tarot reader. He or she is purporting to predict your future based on the cards. He's purporting to be using a deck imbued with metaphysical properties that it does not have. So there's deception in the initial premise as well as in his abilities. And then what he's doing is he's cold reading you, the way that I can't remember a very famous cold reader who would sit in televised audiences, and he would point to random people in the crowd, and he would tell them what their dead mother or their dead father or their dead brother was saying from beyond the grave. He didn't have the ability to read their dead relatives' thoughts. He was cold reading them, together with perhaps some research before the show. So it was deceptive. It may have produced positive value for those people. So those people many of them did walk away from the show with an amazing sense of catharsis, that they'd had this conversation with their dead mom, which they'd never been able to have, but it was done through deception. And what could be happening here is, even while you're helping people to learn about themselves, at the same time, what you're doing is you're trying to convince them of a worldview that's false. In other words, that one can predict the future, that the cards have special metaphysical powers, etc. And that is a very bad thing. We don't generally want to spread misinformation about the nature of reality to people. We want, ideally, in an ideal world, to help people to believe what is true about the nature of reality. And this is not helping in that pursuit.
Good. So I do think it's important to talk about the negatives, for sure. So I'll start with this, the deception thing. So I think it's worth highlighting that it's not essentially a deceptive practice. I mean, what is it essentially, right? Well, what does that mean? Originally, it was playing cards. So does that mean it was like used for just games, like gambling games, and similarly kind of like just how the French suit of playing cards are used for things like poker. And then it just was used for different things over different time periods. And there's this interesting books about the history of tarot. I divide it up into 5 tarot waves. So you have the original playing cards, and then you have the used by the 18th century French occultists, and also then some of those divinatory methods were potentially made popular or spread through Roma people. That's a little bit controversial, like what their role is. Then there was the 60s in the kind of countercultural hippies use, and they kind of really liked those mystic associations from the 18th century mystics, and perhaps also the Roma people, using it as a kind of divinatory fortune telling. So the hippies kind of liked those mystic associations, and that was the 60s. And then later in the 80s, therapists started using it as a tool. And that's where it began to kind of shed, for some people, shed those metaphysical associations and become a naturalistic tool being used for therapy, being used in kind of psychology. And then we have the 5th wave. And this 5th wave is this contemporary wave, which I think is maybe marked by a heterogeneity of use. There's a lot of people using it. It's really popular. It's really taken off. They're using it in a lot of different ways. A lot of different cards, a lot of different creators. So these printing methods have become a lot more cheap and accessible. So lots of artists using it for representation. So here we have like a modern witch tarot, for example. These more kind of contemporary representation. I mentioned earlier that I've got LGBT decks. And then you've got people who are using it in these kind of divinatory ways. You have people like, I live in New Orleans, so there'll be a lot of people who are doing it on the street. And I actually haven't had a street reading here in New Orleans, or in fact anywhere. So I don't know but I bet they vary. I bet they vary a lot with respect to what they're telling people and what their methods are and so on, and what they believe as well, and whether there's a difference between what they believe and what they say. So I want to emphasize the heterogeneity, because I think it's really important methodologically to not lump people together where we instead have to split them apart.
I think that point's well taken, and I'm absolutely happy to refine the objection to all of those people who use it as a divinatory tool. In other words, all those people who do imbue it with meaning, and it's one subset within tarot card readers. It's not every tarot card reader. I'm happy to say that. But then let me narrow the objection to them specifically. It seems that at least in those cases that there is a strong countervailing value associated with using it.
Yeah, it's so funny because you're like, whether it has divinatory powers, i.e. whether they imbue it with meaning. And I'm like, well, I imbue it with meaning, right? Like I imbue it with kind of associations and semantic meaning and the semantics of images. And my remembering previous conversations or discussions and having those associations. So I also imbue it with reading, with meaning. And then I just try to stay really ecumenical about the metaphysical questions. But I agree that even the people who think of the cards as having these kind of metaphysical supernatural powers, even people in that set are going to see those people as fraudsters. Do you see what I'm getting at? So like there'll be some people where like even the people who think, no, these are mystic, these are very special, they're not Italian playing cards, they actually came from some like other tradition, like mystic tradition from the get-go, having really metaphysically loaded, they are fortune telling in this really supernatural way. even they'll say, well, look, there are people who are just doing it for money, who are lying through their teeth to customers using this kind of cold reading. And so it does seem like those people we can criticize epistemically and morally without, fairly readily, I think, because that is kind of fraud, and it's intentional falsehood and deception. And if for at least some of those resulting beliefs or resulting good resolutions, it's going to be relatively coincidental. I say that because I think even people who are doing things like fraud, it's usually an advantage to be speaking the truth. And so this is maybe a kind of, it's like an objection that people could raise to, say, Harry Frankfurt's conception of bullshit, where you don't care whether or not it's true. It's like, well, actually, look, if you're trying to bullshit someone, it's an advantage if it's also true. Like if you're trying to mislead somebody or try to sell something or trying to kind of get someone to do something or manipulate them, it's usually advantageous if what you're saying is also true. So even bullshitters kind of do care about the truth, but just for these other reasons that don't have to do with being an honest person or helping people reach the truth. So just having people think about the future can be a really helpful epistemic tool, and like helping them with their understanding or with their resolve or decision making. So at the end of one of the papers, the main paper on epistemology, I have a section about tarot as a fortune telling tool or a future telling tool. And I just sort of, the way at the beginning of that section is like, well, here's a way that tarot helps you predict the future. It helps you think about the future, helps you talk about the future. It raises these important topics that you might be avoiding, like you might be avoiding thinking about money, or you might be avoiding thinking about your parents or your childhood, and tarot is getting you to do that. And so understand the future. And even the fraudsters, I suppose, can have that kind of epistemic value. I just, insofar as we're understanding these as trading off, it is not going to look good for the fraudsters, because it's kind of like based on a lie. And then there are these other, then it kind of gets trickier about the people who are imbuing it with supernatural powers or some kind of metaphysical or some kind of deeper arcane or mystical or magical power. What is that? And I think it could be that people have relatively nuanced, sophisticated views or varied views about that. So I think in the fifth wave, a lot of the people who see it as having some kind of special, unusual, kind of somewhat hard to explain powers, it's not about predicting the future. It's about special insight into oneself, one's condition, one's social conditions, and that there's something uncanny about tarot's ability to do that, tarot card's ability to do that. And then it's kind of like, well, maybe then you could, it's not what I'm particularly working on, but you could explain all of that through naturalistic means by just saying, yeah, here are some ways it does it. These are bringing up really important life themes. It's these ambiguous evocative images that are causing you to think about yourself in a new way and be honest with yourself in a new way, or it's causing these conversations with other people. But I try not to kind of get too much into the kind of assessing what people are up to, partly because it's an empirical question about knowing what they're up to, which is anthropology, which is not my area, and partly because I want to kind of be creating projects and insights and activities that are open to everybody or a lot of people. That said, so you brought up the negatives, and I do think that there's another set of negatives that have to do with things like confirmation bias and so on. So when I did this at a conference recently, philosophy conference recently, we talked about it afterwards, and a lot of people were like, yeah, lots of confirmation bias, I think, and it was an epistemology conference. And so I think it is important to acknowledge those kinds of problems and the methods for countering it, like the activity of flipping the reading. So you read it one way, and then you think, okay, suppose, how do I then mean that the opposite way? So if you're seeing that particular figure as representing miserliness, and then you kind of have a bunch of interpretive next steps, now you think, okay, that was interesting. I'm going to now imagine that card, Four of Pentacles, actually represents generosity. Now, how would I read it? And flipping the reading can be really interesting. It can be helpful for counteracting, or might be helpful, I'm going to be careful, but it might be helpful for counteracting things like confirmation bias. But it could also be really helpful for things like illuminating your preconceptions, your assumptions. So if you saw that card as representing miserliness, then it had these presuppositions about money. If you now have to flip the reading, that's going to really highlight what those presuppositions are, because you have to explain the presuppositions in a different way. So that's why things like flipping the reading can be really interesting epistemic activities.
So you gave an example earlier of someone who's the outright fraudster, right? So they don't believe the deck has any mystical powers, but they play a character to deceive someone to basically take their money. But it might be that often what's happening is something else, which is that both parties are mistaken and both parties really wanted to have mystical power. So Darren Brown writes about the spiritualist movement, which is almost all practitioners of it have lost someone in their life, like often a child or a husband, and they're trying to connect to the dead, and they will sort of try and channel the figure, and both of them really want to believe that it's true. And he said, he went in there wanting to debunk it, but he said it was so obviously bad. The number of hits that people would get, which are so low, that you didn't have a sort of deceptive practice. On the one end with someone trying to make money out of it because, the community sort of was really doing it out of a sense of generosity. But what you could have is that there's something bad going on if two people are deluded about the nature of the device, that it's maybe even worse than the deceptive practitioner who knows it's, it has no mystical powers, and that you then surrender to the device. So you have the discussion, you believe that this is giving you an insight into the nature of the future, and you make these bad life choices. So that's the one. The other way of thinking about it is that the kinds of ways in which people are going to interact with tarot are often quite personal. So I've got a difficult life decision, like, should I quit my job? Should I leave my husband? Should I go traveling? In a way, these are all kind of quotidian things. And we haven't talked about how you could use it as a tool for things that are more conceptual. So you can imagine someone who's working on a philosophy paper saying, I'm a bit stuck. Would a tarot session be of assistance for trying to find out, what's a good way of solving this problem in philosophy or in some other area that's not about your personal life or a particular sort of tangible problem, but about something a little bit more abstract? Would the process be useful in that light?
Interesting. I feel like so much of what you were saying, I just kept thinking there was like two channels in my mind. There was okay, what should I say in reply? And then there was the, but if this was a podcast on AI, what would I say in reply? Because so much of what you said, I was like, this is happening with AI use. So this idea of this wishful thinking, wanting it to be so. I was just this morning listening to a podcast about AI as religion. I want to say it was by a podcast channel called Power User. I might have misremembered that. But the AI as religion, where people are really seeing like AI has come to, we've unwoken, mine is conscious, mine is a god, and so then interacting with it as seeing it as this kind of spiritual expertise, like this kind of homegrown religion. So I also want to say, like, there's this question of, is it better in the case where the person's deluded, or is it better in the case where they're just a fraudster? And I want to say that we can't really compare these, they're just different, and we just want to understand the different risks, the different pitfalls, the different values and disvalues of different approaches and different epistemic paths through this really interesting practice. So so I do think that wishful thinking is going to be playing a big role. That's going to be one of the big pitfalls for a lot of relevant practices. And also wishful thinking in community too. So when people get together, then they could be even more prone to these kinds of misconceptions or even delusions or sort of confirmation bias. And that this is now we're getting into things like psychology of religion, where for a lot of these kinds of worries, these are also going to be really salient to people thinking about religions and how beliefs in religions work. And this kind of wishful thinking, wanting there to be something after death and so on. And then you sort of pivoted to what about these more abstract uses? And I think this is really interesting and difficult, because now I think when it's talking about these abstract uses, like how to make progress on a philosophy paper, that's getting into that second project I was talking about. So right at the beginning, I mentioned there's the epistemology project of understanding the epistemology of tarot, the values that it has, the interesting questions that it raises, the skills that it can develop, and so on. So things like the distinctive values of having intimate conversations with complete strangers and so on. Then you've got, well, how can it be used as a tool for researching in the classroom? And so one of the activities I have there is to invent a new word. So one of the activities is you draw a card and then kind of talk about that card. Yeah, and it's helpful to scaffold this with this in this kind of space of having more creative. You want to start off cold in your like container facilitation in your classroom. in your workshop. You probably don't want to start with this. You need to warm people up. But, using the card to invent a new word, to invent a new concept or hermeneutical resource or conceptual resource, so like a new interpretive idea, for example. There's also activities like drawing a card and then interpreting it through a particular theory or framework. I haven't really done a lot of that because I don't think of that as particularly my expertise, but kind of drawing a card and then interpreting it through a Freudian framework or through a Jungian framework or so on. Some of the theorists on podcasts do this. There's activities like, I mentioned the flipping the reading one. And so I would draw 2 cards and I'd be like, the first card would be like, what drew me to doing the epistemology of tarot? Like, what does that reveal about me? And I think the second one was like, what vice is this manifesting in me? Just 'cause I think it's really interesting to know about oneself. I think that's a really important kind of knowledge, is self-knowledge, especially one's vices. So then I use that to think through my own thoughts about the project. But then I had another one, which was like, what is explaining the difference between me and one of my kind of interlocutors on the ethics of belief? It was Rima Basu. Like, what explains the difference between me and Rima Basu with respect to our views about moral encroachment? It's kind of riffed, and sort of the cards inspired some answers that I might not have otherwise come to, much like talking to a different interlocutor will just throw in new ideas. And so it had to do with just riffing off the interpretation of the card was like credit for one's efforts, credits for one's successes. That might be something that's driving one of us and not the other, like caring about that, for example. But again, maybe there's confirmation bias there and so on. But it was like at least throwing in new ideas. Another example of that is, so I did a poster session where people would just come up, and then I would just get them to ask questions that they would develop their own questions that bridged their research with their values. So just asking purely about their research, I'd like to get there, but I think the project is not quite there yet. Just asking about their values, well, that's more like orthodox tarot, and I want to get towards the more scholarly and pedagogy uses. So I'm doing that by kind of looking at these bridging questions. And so a question that I asked at one point was, why might philosophy be a valuable field of study for a maths student? And that's the kind of question that if somebody asked me, I would just have a set of answers. I would just say, well, blah, 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 blah. Clear thinking, the word is logic is one of our things, and helping people to think clearly and communicate clearly is valuable, and so on. But that's not what happened. The card was this one. And so this is 8 of Cups. But what was really salient to me, well, I wasn't really thinking 8 of Cups. 8 would have an orthodox meaning, and Cups has an orthodox meaning. But instead, what I just saw was journey, like on a journey. And what it made me think of was, if maths was just a pure like static thing, like this is what maths is, then maybe, they're mathematicians, just learn maths, that's fine. But because maths is transitioning, it's on a journey, it's changing over time, then we need those scholars to have studied things like philosophy so that they can help maths to change and understand those changes. That's a really left field idea that I think I wouldn't have otherwise had if not for asking that question, and then being presented with a card where really saliently, the dude's on a journey. And I was doing it with somebody else who was like, well, actually really salient to me, and then says something completely different. So that's a kind of an example of how tarot use in research can throw in new ideas. And, there are various other kind of worries and various other benefits, like inventing new hermeneutical resources, new words. But this is really the beginning of the project, and I'm still working on it. So I'll still kind of get to a group of philosophers and I'll be like, hey, guys, let's do the thing and see what's happening. And I'm still, every time I do that, I'm just learning so much about it, about its potential.
For me, it raises 2 concerns. The one is very easily remedied, I guess. The first concern is that perhaps it's out of date. So these images are old images, and you did show examples of new decks. I imagine iconography and imagery does lose social currency over time, and does lose richness and resonance over time. So there might be an argument for tarot losing resonance with time unless it's updated. So that would be the first objection. The second one would be its usefulness may depend a lot on the psychological profile of the person who is being read. So some people are very rigorous thinkers, and having new input is very valuable because it gets put into the rigorous machinations of their mind, and they spit out something really rigorously thought through, which they wouldn't have thought of otherwise. And I see enormous value in that. Other people are sloppy thinkers, and you don't want to introduce any more randomness into their thought process. That's just going to make what's sloppy completely nuts. And I've watched people do this. So I have been to tarot readings, and I've watched people who were always sloppy with their intellectual thinking just become sloppier. And what the tarot did for them was it basically introduced larger logical leaps between things. And that could be useful in certain contexts, like let's say they're an artist. I can see great usefulness there, but it could be very damaging in other contexts, like let's say you're a scientist and you have to very carefully map out your steps. So yeah, those are two objections, I think, to tarot.
Excellent. You know, it's funny, I also, just going back to the previous comments, I was holding the cards up and I totally had intended to describe the cards as I was holding them up, and I forgot. So maybe I will just say that the card that I was holding up, the Eight of Cups, very saliently, there's a person who has crossed some water and is heading towards the mountains. And this is, to me, this is like the most obvious thing, is the mountain scene, and the person is walking off into the mountains into the distance. But there may be other cards that I held up and forgot to describe in that way. Okay, so the first thing that you mentioned about these images losing resonance over time, I think that's, again, this interesting empirical question. So tarot has not been studied all that much. There are some books on the history of tarot. There are some people thinking through these questions, but not a lot. There's really not many people. And this is part of what's driving the tarot project, is bringing those people together and bringing together other thinkers from lots of different fields to begin to develop more of this scholarship about tarot, using tarot, and also better understanding tarot. So there are these empirical psychology questions about, well, are the older decks less useful for people who are younger or more recently, you know, more like 21st century people or 20th century people as opposed to other people, 18th century people? Or is it could it also be a matter of education? So for people who just simply don't know the myths and legends and the theology, will just see fewer things. And then there's also epistemic and psychological disposition. So some people just aren't particularly adept or experienced at reading images. And so might see things like, I could see like, oh, compositionally, there's this huge expanse above the person's head and it's not required for some other feature of the composition. And therefore it has this really interesting meaning. And some other people, that might not occur to them. They might just be kind of stumped, like, what am I looking at? And other people will have even more nuance with respect to what they're looking at, like much more experience at visual interpretation. On those, of course, practicing it by doing it can also improve and hone those skills, which I think is another really nice pedagogical value of using tarot in the liberal arts as an educational tool. Oh, and by the way, one of the main reasons to do it is that so many of the students love tarot. So it's kind of a way to get them to engage, is they love tarot. And so why not use this thing that they're already invested in? But then you raise this empirical question, are the more recent images more up to date with their iconography? So do they have things like emojis and sort of more recent kind of images of technology and so on that would have just more? So that's a great question. I'm just going to open now the modern witch tarot deck, which is quite common. Oh yeah. So I only use the old school one, but I just had a quick look at the first one, and the person's wearing a denim jacket with some cool sewn on, and I know what these are cool. I'm not cool. I'm just not a cool person. These patches sewn on, and they're wearing these kind of funky sneakers. So yeah, maybe there's more resonance. It's a good empirical question. I think that'd be a really cool thing for the tarot project to have somebody working on. But that would be an argument not for not using the old ones, but just experimenting more with the new ones, or even developing new ones that have more images that are designed to hit resonance for individuals. So right here to my right, I also have the Philosopher's Tarot deck, for example. And so the Philosopher's Tarot deck was designed by somebody with a philosophy PhD, and one might well think that that will then have more imagery and iconography that is more relevant to philosophy. Again, that would be an empirical question. You can buy this online, the Philosopher's Tarot deck. This one is René Descartes. Is the Page of Pentacles here. So this is an image of what would have been a classic tarot image, but the person has been replaced by René Descartes, and is otherwise relatively similar. So then that would have different kinds of associations, where one who knows about René Descartes in the history of philosophy might well be thinking, yes, he's there by himself, he's thinking by himself, he's just reflecting on this one thing, and so on. Actually, one of the orthodox meanings of this particular one, Page of Pentacles, is start with what's right there in front of you. And so that actually kind of fits well with Descartes' method of doubt, like what is right there in front of you that's kind of like right there, it's indubitable, you can't. And so that's probably not a coincidence. The person who designed this deck probably will have picked out that one partly for those kinds of associations with Descartes' thoughts. So I think you can create, maybe this will be a project. Well, actually, my students have created tarot decks that are designed around Tulane. So to create iconography that's more salient to Tulane students. And I would like for people in the tarot project to design their own tarot decks. And that'd be an interesting creative project, if nothing else. So I think that's just kind of an argument in a way for like more, not less. But then you raise this other worry, which is much more like an argument for less, which is like, what about sloppiness? What about when open-mindedness is bad, or throwing in new ideas is bad? And yeah, I think, and the way that you framed it was beginning at least, was mostly to do with the rigorous versus the sloppy thinkers. But I also think it's important to emphasize there's also the questions and contexts and decisions that would be best suited to more open-minded, expansive, and creative thought, compared to the ones where that's really typically not so helpful. And you mentioned that at the end with like the artistic projects and questions versus, I mean, you compared it to the science ones. I think maybe if it was something like, where should I invest this windfall of money that I've just received? For some people, it could be like, I'll do some tarot readings to really open up creatively open up the range of possibilities I'm considering before I decide. But for some people, for some contexts, that could be a terrible idea. And because what they should instead do is just phone an advisor and just put the money where the advisor says. Like, otherwise they're going to try investing it in some startup project that isn't a good idea for them or something. So and I think that this, again, it's understanding the diversity, understanding the heterogeneity, so the different people and their cognitive and psychological and epistemic characters, the different questions and contexts, and then the different uses. So relying on it as a way to make decisions or as a definitive set of answers could be epistemically and ethically very different from using it as an inspiration, as a tool for conversation, as a way to have more inventive and creative, say like inventing new words and so on, as one step in this kind of breadth of our epistemic conduct, this kind of breadth of epistemic normativity. I think epistemology tends to focus too much on getting true beliefs about a particular pre-existing question. And I think there are these other things like, what questions are we asking? What concepts are we using to think? Like, epistemology is really broad. And what are we not noticing? What are we focusing too much on? And so tarot could be really great for some of those things, even if it's sometimes not so great for getting true beliefs about some kinds of questions.
So you evoked AI as an oracle in comparison to tarot, and there's a sort of story that's gone around recently about paranoid schizophrenics developing these very strong bonds with ChatGPT, and how it's been very good at taking them down those dark rabbit holes and amplifying the paranoia and the sort of, completely crazy conspiracy theory stuff. And that's not most people's interaction with ChatGPT. Most people will be able to have a very sensible discussion, learn something new about the world. But maybe the sort of parallel is that if you are the right kind of person who has the right level of distance from tarot or AI, you're able to go on this wonderful journey and find out new things about the world and yourself. But that if you're Jason Sloppy thinker, maybe taken to an extreme, that both AI and tarot could be incredibly dangerous in that your mind is already so blown open that this could take you down a path that could be very dangerous. But maybe it's because it has a sort of powerful effect attached to it, it amplifies, the more disturbed elements in certain kinds of people. But that doesn't mean that as a product for the discerning, that it's not, a wonderful thing. Georgie, I want to say this is a wonderful conversation. I think you're one of the few philosophers who's really comfortable with experimenting with things that fall outside of the usual domain. And that's a really good way to make people excited about hard topics like epistemology, that you've latched onto something that students care about, and then that covers multiple domains. So, you've got this, the art element in tarot, the mystical element in it, the play element in it, and being able to take all of those things together, I think is wonderful for your students and wonderful for our listeners. So for those of you listening back home, please tell us what you think about tarot. Do you have a favorite deck? Are you a Rider-Waite person? I have a beautiful Dali deck, which I'm very fond of. And we're always keen to hear feedback from our listeners.
Yeah, and I want to just thank you so much. I really appreciate these opportunities to talk. It's so funny, right at the end, what you said about comparing to AI is making me think that the next grant project, this could be a real winner, is a grant project where people who want to do the epistemology of AI, there's a lot of grants being proposed for that, as comparison with tarot, so, like with respect to the different pitfalls and character traits and best practices and so on. And yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Awesome.